Hey guys, it's Don here for the OSBGL, and I'm back with another episode of Battle Company Breakdown. This will be the third episode of Battle Company Breakdown that I've filmed. I've done two previous episodes. One was on Isengard, and then I did one on Minas Tirith. And those are two of the really popular factions in SBG and in Battle Companies, both really good factions. Definitely near the top of the list in terms of competitive. Both of them have tons of options for gaining experience, advancements, all that kind of stuff. Lots of war gear to play with. Really fun battle companies to use. So this time I thought I would go to the other end of the spectrum, so to speak. And you can probably see in the title of the video that we're going to be talking about Sharkey's Rogues. So kind of going from the top of the barrel all the way down to the bottom of the barrel with this faction. And I guess that's going to be one of the things that I'm going to get you guys to try to help me figure out is this the worst faction in Battle Companies? Is it the worst faction in SBG? So we'll have to go over it and see, but right off the top, it certainly seems like a really big contender for the bottom spot in Battle Companies, but we'll see. What I do, although this is me talking in this video, what I try to do is get as many pictures of the models for this battle company as I can and post them throughout the video, because otherwise wouldn't really need to be a video. I could do an audio presentation of this. So in the past two, for Minas Tirith and Isengard, I put up a call in our local Facebook group here, OSBGL in Ontario, Canada, and asked for pictures for models from those factions that I could use in the video, and in both cases got a lot of response because they're super popular factions. So I had a lot of really good pictures provided to me, which was great, and I used some of my own. So I thought, well, we'll do the same thing this time and see what happens. So I put up the post looking for pictures of ruffians and, you know, a few of wildmen if people have them, because they're in the faction too. And it was crickets. Not one person submitted a picture. Not really a surprise, because ruffians are just not all that popular in the game in general. Sure, there are like a lot of scenarios which involve ruffians, but in terms of match play, nobody plays them, really. And there's a reason for that. So what I ended up having to do is I do have my own models, but I think I only have about a dozen of them. So I painted, that are painted. So I took some photographs of those to use, which I'll put up. And you know, my painting is not great. I'm not a painter. Kind of like a journeyman paint job, I guess. Tabletop quality. So what I did was I actually went and approached two people and asked them if they could provide me with some photographs, because I knew both of them both have those models and like playing with them. So one was Travis Freeburn, a member of the OSBGL here for many years, absolutely fantastic guy. So I reached out to him and asked him if he could provide me with some photos. He didn't really have any, so he got all of his stuff out and took some photographs for me, which, you know, doubled the amount of photographs that I had. So that was great. Thanks very much for that, Travis. I really appreciate it. And the only other person I actually know that has painted ruffians is Jeremy from the Green Dragon, Jeremy Hunthor. And, you know, he doesn't know me from Adam. But anyway, I approached him on Facebook, told him what I was doing, asked him if he would mind if I used some of the pictures of his ruffian models, which are absolutely fantastic. The guy is an incredible painter. And yeah, he had no problem with it. He was very welcoming. Said that I could use them, no problem. So thank you very much, Jeremy, for that. Really appreciate it. So in this video, like I usually do, I'm going to score the faction on the competitive side out of 5. And I'll also score it from an enjoyment perspective. How enjoyable is this faction to play in battle companies? And in addition to that, there's kind of 3 questions that I also really want to answer. And one of them I've already said, and it's like, is this the worst faction in battle companies? The other one, is the ruffian model the most undervalued, or I'm trying not to say the worst, but you get the idea. Is the ruffian model the worst model in SBG? Is the profile the worst for the points? And the other thing is, can I talk about this faction for 30 minutes? Because it is pretty sparse in terms of what you can take. But we'll see how that goes. Also, I think there's a couple of oversights in this faction that really need to be addressed. So we'll take a look at those. And at the end, maybe I'll make a couple of suggestions of things that can be done to help this faction. And I've got my books here. I've got my Battle Company book. I've got the Scouring of the Shire book. And I've even got this old Fallen Realms book all here to help me sort of figure out what the deal is with this faction. Okay, so let's go through this faction and see exactly what we're dealing with here with Sharkey's Rogues. And first what I'll do is I'll read the bit of fluff at the beginning of the faction. Following his army's defeat at Helm's Deep and his subsequent banishment from Isengard, Saruman secretly made his way west to the Shire under the guise of an old withered man with the name of Sharkey. Here he set about gathering ruffians and wildmen to him, hatching a scheme to take control over the Shire and the halflings that lived there as vengeance for the defeat that the travelers had brought upon him. After plotting and buying his way into control over the Shire, Sharkey assumed full command under the name of the Chief, and sent bands of his ruffians across the Shire and surrounding lands to spread his will. Some of these groups of ruffians and wildmen often venture a bit further than instructed to bully local villages, especially if there was some extra money to be had. Okay, so basically there's just a bunch of thugs. That's what this warband is. So let's take a look at the starting warband. Okay, you start with, what do you start with? You start with 9 models. You start with 3 ruffians, 2 ruffians with a bow, 1 ruffian with a whip, and 3 wildmen of Dunland. So you get wildmen in this faction as well. What about reinforcements? Okay, well there's no special reinforcement chart. There's just one reinforcement chart. As normal, 1 is a nothing, 2 is a wildman of Dunland, 3 is a ruffian with nothing, 4 is a ruffian with a whip, 5 is a ruffian with a bow, and 6 is an orc with choice of weapon. And that last one, it really helps this faction. What about the army-specific upgrade? Okay, it's called Strength in Numbers. The hero is no more than a bully and is in their element when fighting with the odds in their favor. If the hero is involved in a fight where there are more friendly models than enemy models, the hero gains a bonus of +1 when rolling to wound. So that's a pretty good army bonus, because +1 to wound is like one of the best bonuses that you can get. Anything gives you +1 to wound, really good. And that's it. That's all there is to this faction. One of the first things that jumps out to me right away here is that there's no advancements. And like I said on all of the ones I've done, is there needs to be advancements in every battle company, especially in a battle company where the units in it are so terrible as they are in this one. The reason why there aren't any is because there's no obvious model for these guys to advance into. Sure, you could make the Wildman turn into a Dunlending warrior, but this faction isn't about Dunlending warriors. They have their own faction, right? So it really needs to be an advancement for the Ruffian, and it's just not here. Alright, let's talk about the models for this faction, because this is one thing in this faction that I really like. I really like the Ruffian models. They're old models, but they really hold up well still today. And they're all one-piece models, and you know, they've got models just with a hand weapon, they've got models with a whip, and they've got several different models with bow. So really like the old Ruffian models, and they're still quite good. And just recently, when the Scouring of the Shire came out, they put out 3 new Forge World heroes for these guys, which would be great to use in battle companies. Sid Briarthorn, Ruffian Chief, Rowan Thistlewood, Ruffian Enforcer, and Bill Fernie. So they've got those 3 new models to use here as well, and all of them are very nice. Nothing terribly fancy, because they're just kind of outlaw type models, but very nice models. Then we've got Wildmen of Dunland. Again, like all metal models, one-piece models, and they either have a guy with a hand weapon or a guy with a two-handed weapon. Good models, perfectly decent, nothing fancy, but for this faction, quite good still. The last thing is Orcs, and Orcs, they give you a ton of flexibility because there's so many models you can use. You can't get Orcs with heavy armor in this faction, so you're just looking at your plastic Mordor Orcs or the metal Mordor Orcs if you happen to own any of those. But because there are plastics, there you go, you can do some conversions. They've got lots of different poses there. So those are the models, mostly metal, a couple from Forge World, and then you got Orcs, which are like a lot of options with Orcs. So pretty decent selection of models. Okay, let's look at the pros and cons of this faction. And we'll start with the pros. Now, okay, we're gonna have to like lower the bar a little bit on the pros because these guys really don't have a lot going for them. So, they have an average selection of war gear available to them and available to their heroes, and that is thanks to the inclusion of the Orc warrior in the faction. Like adding that model into the faction, it allows your heroes to get shields, for example, or two-handed weapons, spears. Without that, I don't even want to think about trying to play this faction. The faction special rule is good. It is a good faction special rule if you can make it work. Making it work is the hard part, but the rule itself is good. They start with 9 models, so that's a lot of models to start, and quite often in battle companies, you can win your first 3 games, like no matter how terrible your guys are, is if you outnumber the guy by 3 models or 4 models, you can easily get traps and kill and quickly win a game. They have access to a throwing weapon, because throwing weapons are certainly not available in every faction. So it's good, they actually have access to a throwing weapon. It happens to be the worst throwing weapon there is in the whip, but it's still a throwing weapon. This faction, these guys can take creatures. Normally you'd probably be looking at the hunting dog in this, but I mean, if you do actually have an orc that becomes a hero, he can take a warg, which would be a ridiculous upgrade for this faction. And you know the faction is in trouble when you're saying like a warg would be a really ridiculous upgrade. But it is possible to get a warg as a creature for one of your either leader or sergeants. And that would actually allow you to get up to 18 models, which is good. Like we talked before, Isengard, like they can't take extra stuff like that, so they're kind of stuck at 15 models. Of course, anyone can take a pack horse, any faction can take the pack horse, but honestly, in this faction, there's no reason really to take a pack horse. You just don't have enough equipment flying around to really be worried about that. Okay, let's look at the cons for this faction, and this is not a short list. All of their models in this faction are strength 3. So you cannot get a strength 4 model unless you have an orc hero grab a warg. There's a strength 4, but this means that anything you play early that's defense 6, you're going to need 6s to wound it. It's not a huge disadvantage early in the game because most things start at defense 5, but later on it's going to become a problem. Also, low fight value. So all of the starting models in this warband are either fight 3 or fight 2 in the case of the ruffian. So that is a big problem. Also, defense. Your defense is low. All your starting models have a defense of 3. So your guys are gonna drop like crazy if you start losing combats or get shot up with bow shots. Again, the orc can come in at defense 4 and get a shield for defense 5. So the fact that the shield is available means that you can make your heroes go up to defense 4 if they use a shield, which is something, but still not great. The warband size, limited to 15 models, and that seems really odd for this faction. Also, you have a lot of the key war gear for battle companies missing from this faction, and that is heavy armor. Can't get it. There's no good missile weapon. You can get the human bow or orc bow, so you know the human bow, it's okay, but you can't get an elven bow or a crossbow or any of that good stuff. And no mounts, so you can't get any mounts for your heroes. The other thing with this faction is it doesn't actually have a go-to strategy on the table. They're really not good at anything, to be quite frank. Like, are they a horde? No. Do they have mobility? No. Are they strong in ranged combat? No. Are they good in melee combat? No. So they're just not good at anything. So you really have to like scrounge and work hard to try to win a game. If there was ever a faction where you say focus on the mission, yeah, this is the faction. The other thing is their reinforcements. Their reinforcements are all really low cost, low quality warriors. Like when you're rolling on the reinforcement table, you really want to get a 6 so you can get an orc. Yeah, an orc. Like that's like the elite model of this faction. So when you say that, you know you're in trouble. But what it means, like as you're going through a campaign and playing, you know, this faction, you know, if you're lucky, you're gonna roll a 6 and get an orc. Whereas like your opponents are getting like, you know, Uruk-hai berserkers or like really good mounted warriors that are worth like upwards of 20 points. You know, you're getting like a 6-point model where they're getting models that are worth 3 times that much potentially. So over time, like you just fall farther behind against your competition. So that's a huge factor. War gear. So I mentioned before that the inclusion of the orc really saves this area for the warband. So your war gear here consists of a shield, a spear, a bow, an orc bow, a two-handed weapon, and a whip. So it's not great, but you have like a decent selection of war gear for your heroes there. Sort of the bizarre thing about this faction is like for archery, you can't get any more than your normal 33% archery for the warband. The funny thing is here that the guys you want to give your bows to are the wildmen, and I'm talking about heroes, because they actually have a shoot value of 4+. So wildmen in the main game of SBG, they can't even get a bow. But in this faction, in a sort of weird way, you kind of want to make your starting heroes the wildmen and give them bows because they hit on a 4+. By far your best option for shooting. And I mentioned before, you know, orcs bring shields to the faction, so like if you don't want to give your heroes bows, you can give them a shield and give them +1 defense and the ability to shield. Okay, what about equipment? Because sometimes like the equipment section will really save a faction because of what they can take. Not really the case here. Again, one of the ones that I always say is a good equipment option, especially for evil, is Poison Blade and Poison Arrow. Reason why is because they only cost 1 point, and they're always 1 point. Doesn't matter how good your hero gets, they stay at 1 point. You can give them to warriors too if you want. So, you know, you could give them to your archers, give them poison arrows if you wanted, and might help you out a bit. And it's not a huge investment in points, it's 1 point. If you do have a guy start as a ranger, conceal and cloak, you know, it's always a good option, especially here where your guy's defense is so low. Shooting, it can often rack up a bunch of kills in the game. So if you can have a guy that becomes a good archer in this game and have him protected by a concealing cloak, you know, he can do okay even with a defense of 3. The one piece of war gear that I like kind of frown at in this game because it's a little bit overpowered are manacles. Like manacles, you can paralyze your opponent, and I don't know, it comes off as a little bit cheesy in the game, because being paralyzed when you're only using like 6 or 8 models in a game and you have one of your guys get paralyzed, it's like, oh, it's terrible. But if there is a faction that should be considered as okay to take manacles, this is the faction. And the thing is, if you look at the 3 new models from Forge World that I talked about earlier, all of them have manacles actually on the figures, I believe, or at least 2 out of the 3 of them do. And you know what? I wouldn't be shy about taking manacles for this faction. If you're using this faction, go for it. Creatures. So just touched on this briefly before. You can get a pack horse, of course, but you can get hunting dogs because ruffians are men, so are wildmen, and you could possibly get a warg if you have an orc become a hero, which would be great. If you could get a warg in here, oh my god, it would be incredible. Higher strength, higher defense, higher movement, higher fight. It's better everywhere than your basic troops. Okay, what about paths for your heroes for Sharkey's rogues? Okay, so what can you not take? Well, you don't have mounts available, so you can't take the Path of the Knight. And you don't have any beasts available, so you can't take the Path of the Beast. That leaves Warrior, Ranger, General, Scout, Adventurer, and Sorcerer. So kind of for thematic reasons here, I would probably start out with one of your heroes being a sorcerer. And if nothing else, it gives you a good excuse to use your Sharkey model. And you can only have one sorcerer in your battle company. So if you're going to take a sorcerer, it's a good idea to have one of your starting guys become a sorcerer, because they start already with one will, one fate, and one might, and then if once they become sorcerer, they get a second point of will, so they get like an immediate jump forward, which would take like a long time for them to catch up to if you're waiting for a guy to get hero in the making and then make him a sorcerer. It takes a lot longer for them to sort of develop. So for me, the most natural fit for a path for this faction is the scout. Most games that are either role-playing games or games where you can take classes or whatever, they all have a class or a path like the thief, or like an outlaw, or a scout, or a rogue, like as in Sharkey's rogues. And in this one here, it's the scout. And it's got a lot of really useful upgrades for a model that is so terrible, like the ruffian is. You can get upgrades to fight, shoot, you can get throwing daggers, poison blades, you can get heroic defense, and merge into shadows, which is basically like a concealing cloak. Plus more of the standard upgrades to your stats. And, of course, the model for Worm would be a good model to use as a scout, or in this case, like a rogue, or like an assassin, or whatever you want to call them. As you have access to bows, I'm talking human bow here, you probably want to have one of your starting heroes follow the path of the ranger. And if you're going to do that, make sure it's a wildman, because they start with a 4+ shoot. So if I was to play this faction, my starting paths for my heroes would be sorcerer, that would be my leader, and I would play with a scout and a ranger, and even my scout, I would give him a bow, I think. And that leaves warrior, adventurer, and general. And all of those have a place in your warband, even the adventurer. And normally I kind of poo-poo the adventurer path, but in this case, even that path is decent for this faction, because of the fearless, and they can improve their courage a lot, so which are both helpful. Ideally, you get some orc warriors and they become heroes in the making, and you can make one of them a warrior, and that would really help you out. In all cases there, like, make sure you take shields on these guys for the +1 defense, and you can even get your orcs up to defense 5, the mighty defense 5 for this faction. So how do you develop this warband? And again, we're assuming that you're not going to just play half a dozen games with any faction and then stop playing them. We're assuming here that you're in this for the long haul, and you're going to play like upwards of 15 to 20 games with any faction. So how do you develop the warband over time? And I think with this one, the best approach you can take is just to try to increase the number of models that you have in your faction as quickly as possible. So while you see other factions are buying expensive equipment and war gear, just spend the vast amount of your influence on reinforcement rolls. One of the really only pros that you have that is really good is that you start with 9 models, and you're going to outnumber most of your opponents early, so you want to try to keep that advantage as long as you can. And let's face it, with defense 3 across the board, you're going to have models getting knocked out and missing games and maybe even die. So like, those guys need to be replaced as quickly as possible. You're going for quantity here. Try to keep your quantity up as long as you can. Also, when you look at the reinforcement chart for this warband, it's kind of funny, because at the bottom end you have the wildman, and at the top end with a 6 you have the orc, and in the middle 3, 4, and 5 you have ruffians. So the only time you actually want to get a ruffian is when you have space for another bow. Other than that, ideally you're hoping to get a wildman or an orc, just because they're better. It's kind of an odd thing, but what you may want to do is seriously consider using like a point of influence. Like if you roll a 3, use a point of influence, reduce it to a 2, get the wildman. Same as if you get a 5, spend 1. Definitely in the case of a 5, spend 1 to get an orc. An orc is so much better, it's ridiculous. And anytime you do manage to get an orc, always make sure you take them with a shield, not a two-handed weapon or a bow. Always take the shield, because this is the only way that you're going to be able to form anything even remotely close to like a battle line. Like if you can eventually get like 3 or 4 orcs with shields, and you can have like a group of guys in the center of your line that are defense 5. And if you can afford it, like a little later on, give them a spear too. So you have orcs with shield and spear. Because in this case, I've always said in the past videos that spears just aren't as important in battle companies, and they're not. But in this case, you're going to have a lot of models that are fight 2. So, if you can have orcs with spears floating around, like they can back up your ruffians with a spear support. It really helps. So I normally also talk about tactics and more on how to build your warband. Kindly already touched on this, and in this one there's really not a lot to do. I said increase your numbers as much as possible, and once you've got yourself up to 15, then buy hunting dogs. In fact, even before you get up to 15, you're probably going to want to buy hunting dogs, because they're better than most of the models in your faction, which is kind of ridiculous, honestly. The only equipment, again, I would consider are poison arrows, maybe poison blades, concealing cloaks for your heroes. Late campaign, okay, if you manage to play this faction and keep with it until late campaign, really consider like taking a mercenary fighter and like kick out a ruffian from your warband and grab a mercenary fighter. Like, you don't have the luxury to spend a ton of influence on expensive equipment and mounts and all this other stuff. So, it costs you a couple of influence to like keep a mercenary fighter in your warband, but like a mercenary fighter is like so much better than the average model in your warband. It's worth it. Alright, so let's do a bit of a summary here, and we'll give out a couple of scores. And this is just my opinion, like, could totally be wrong. I've never played the faction. Like most people, like I look at the faction and be like, ugh, I don't really want to play that. Which is a shame, honestly, because like I think the faction could be really fun one to play, and it's got nice models. But like, what would I say for a score out of 5 on how fun is this faction to play? So things to consider. Okay, there's no warrior advancements available. So right there, that's a big like downer, because that's such a big part of battle companies, and not having that really stinks. There's no special chart for reinforcements. Kind of figures, because I don't know what the model they would have as a special reinforcement, because the faction is quite simple. So it's maybe not appropriate that they have a special chart, but the fact that they don't, it kind of takes away from the faction. The only models that you can get as reinforcements are poor quality models. So it's not like you're going to be, oh my god, I rolled a 6 and got like an Uruk-hai berserker. And it's like, no, that's not going to happen. It's like, if you're lucky, you're going to get an orc with a shield. And it's like, alright. They have an average selection of war gear for the faction, but you can't get cavalry or even heavy armor, and like those things are important. You want to keep your heroes alive in a game which is basically about like developing heroes. So it would be good even if you could somehow give your heroes armor, but like giving models armor in battle companies is not a thing. It's either It's either you start with armor and go to heavy armor, or you just don't have armor, period. So, and in this case, it's no armor, period, unless you're an orc. So this faction, well, it's certainly a challenge. Like, if you think you're like a really good player of SBG, then play this faction. See how you do. Because, like I said, you don't have a lot going for you. So it does offer that. So the faction is really weak in terms of how good it is. But in spite of that, I think they're, you know, I wouldn't automatically want to just give it a 1 out of 5, because if you play this faction, you know you're playing a faction that's terrible. So you've already made that realization, I would hope. So you're prepared for that. And who knows, maybe you're looking for a challenge. So I'm going to say that this is probably a 2 out of 5. And simply because it's like, if you want to challenge yourself, this is the faction to play right here. What about competitive? How competitive is this faction? And right off the top, it's a 1 out of 5. There's no way this faction is you could improve this faction and still it would be a 1 out of 5, I would say. It's very weak, and unfortunately, even if you stick with this faction and play like 15 to 20 games alongside your buddies who are playing whatever other faction they're playing, it's like they'll be better than you almost from the word go right to the end. And that's because like I said earlier, like you spend 3 influence to get like a ruffian. They spend 3 influence and they get like, you know, a 12-point model or something like that. There's just no comparison that way. Or like even like some of the models that are, you know, like Hobbits or Goblins, like their models are basically the same level of quality, and in their charts they can get 2 models in several of the factions. Well, there's nowhere here where you can get 2 models. So even over time, this faction, it starts out weak and stays weak against your competition right through the whole campaign. So yeah, definitely a 1 out of 5 in terms of how competitive is it. Okay, so let's talk for a second about why is this faction so bad? Because it doesn't have to be this bad. And maybe what can be done about it. So you primarily have 3 different units at your disposal here. And I'm going to put a chart up on the screen that shows all of their profiles. And so you can see all 3 of these models are a base cost of 5 points. So you would think that they are pretty level in terms of how good they are. Now you can see the orc, basically no special rule. His stats are his stats, and that's it. The Wildman of Dunland, he has a special rule, hatred against Rohan. Really good special rule, but only useful against Rohan. Ruffians also have a special rule, Adam Lads. And it's just an okay special rule, and it's only useful against hobbits. And basically what it does is it gives them a fight 3 against hobbits. So like how many factions are there? Like high 30s, 35, 37, whatever number of factions. So if by fluke you play a hobbit faction, or the Shire I guess it's called, yeah, okay, great, your guys suddenly go to fight 3. But other than that, you're with a fight 2. And you know, if you look at the other stats, if you compare like the Ruffian to the Wildman, for example, like both have a special rule, so you know that's like equal. But the fight value and shoot value of the Wildman of Dunland are both better than the Ruffian. Okay. And then you scroll down to the end of the profile. Well, they also have +1 courage. So why would you ever want a ruffian instead of a wildman? Well, you wouldn't. You would always want to get a Wildman of Dunland over a ruffian. And if you look at the orc profile versus those 2 profiles, you can see again the orc, he starts with a fight 3. Okay, so that's better than the ruffian, and the same as the wildman. The wildman has a better shoot, but then the orc has a 4 defense because he starts with armor. So again, like you want to get orcs and wildmen of Dunland in a faction that's supposed to be about ruffians. It doesn't make sense here. And the reason is because, like, the ruffian profile, if you compare it against other profiles, something's wrong with it. It's so bad now. Like before, in the previous edition, that unit cost 4 points, and it had a fight 3 and a shoot of 4+. So in the new version of the rules, it got a lower fight value, a lower shoot value, and had 1 point added to it, and it did get the Adam Lads. And again, that's only good against hobbits. So I assume that the reason that was done was to make the ruffian model work better in the scenarios in the Scouring of the Shire book. But what has ended up happening is now that you have a model whose profile, when you sort of remove it from that very specific bubble and put it out into the wider world of SBG, the profile just does not stand up against models of a comparative value. Let's take a look at a couple other models here. So we'll expand this chart a bit, and we'll add in the hunting dog and the goblin warrior. So the goblin, like the Goblin Town goblin warrior. So first let's look at the hunting dog. Okay, so in the game, a hunting dog costs 3 influence and is worth 3 points. Well, to get a ruffian, you're looking at spending 3 influence to roll on the reinforcement chart. And if you get a ruffian, he's worth 5 points. Well, it doesn't take long looking at the profile that the hunting dog is like far better than a ruffian. You know, it moves faster, it's got like a better fight value, and it's got a better courage value, and it's cheaper, 2 points cheaper. So like that creature in the game, so you could have a sergeant in the game, he gets a hunting dog, and he's better than almost half of your warband. He's better than all of the ruffians in your warband. So there is like something is not right with the point value. So again, look at the goblin warrior. So they're cheaper at 4 points. They're also slower, so it's looking worse than the ruffian. Fight and shoot value are the same. Strength is the same. Defense is the same. Attack 1, wound 1, courage 2. So everything across the board is pretty well the same. Goblin warrior is only a move of 5. So it does kind of make sense that they would be a little bit cheaper. But then you look at the special rules, and they've got Chittering Hordes and Cave Dweller, and both of those special rules are far better than Adam Lads. Like, Chittering Hordes is like ridiculously awesome special rule for that faction, and it's what makes them so competitive, because it allows every model in that to be basically considered to be armed with a spear. Or support, I guess, as if they were armed with a spear. And you can use whatever, like if you have a two-handed weapon or an axe, you can piercing or two-handed. Like, it's such a good rule. So that rule there is, you know, where Adam Lads is basically not really worth even 1 point. Like, Chittering Hordes is definitely worth 1 point for sure. And so is Cave Dwellers. Cave Dwellers for like a horde faction is like an excellent rule. So really, the value of that Goblin Warrior is you're getting like 2 extra points worth of special rules, I would say, at least there. So again, like the Ruffian profile against that unit in the game, it just doesn't make sense. And again, I suppose the reason that was done was because, like, by and large, these models, they're kind of, you only really see them in scenario play. Like, you just don't see them in match play anymore. But the reason is because, like, who would buy them? Like, when you're talking about models that are worth, say, between 15 and 20 points, warrior models, let's say that you calculate what that model should be worth and you end up being off by like 1 point. Well, it's far less noticeable if you're dealing with a 15-point model and that model probably should have been 14 or 16 points. The impact of that is quite minor compared to a model that's either 4 or 5 points, and you're off on the point value of the model by even a single point, and then you multiply that model over the army, and you may have like 40 or 50 of those models in the army. That means you're off by like 40 or 50 points in your army. Like the size of your army could be like 20% larger. Like it has a huge impact on the game. So it just, like, when you see that profile taken outside of the bubble that is the Scouring of the Shire, you can just see that it doesn't really work. Okay, so what could we do to improve Sharkey's rogues in battle companies? You know, in what's the Rohan supplement called? I've forgotten. But in the Rohan supplement, which was the most recent one, they actually had a new page in there for a new version of the Dunland faction, and those changes made that faction go from like lower than mid-tier to like much higher than mid-tier. Like such a huge improvement, and that it's a shame because it probably should have been done for this faction as well in Scouring of the Shire, and I guess they just didn't think of doing that until they came to the War in Rohan book. And it's too bad because it's almost now like, you know, Sharkey's Rogues has kind of missed their chance to have like a better faction breakdown provided for them, which is too bad. But like, is there anything that could be done? And who knows, maybe I've missed something. Like, I've looked through the Scouring of the Shire to see if there's any notes in regards to the Battle Company faction. I can't see any. I looked at the designer's notes and FAQs. There's nothing in there about it. So as far as I can tell, there's no change to any of these profiles or the faction at all. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But, you know, let me know. But let's take a look at the Legendary Legion in the Scouring of the Shire book for the Chief's Ruffians. Because in that one there, they have a lot of special rules aimed at trying to improve the ruffian in that list. But the thing is that, like, none of these are available outside of the Legendary Legion, so they currently don't apply to ruffians in battle companies. Okay, so here are the things that are in the Chief's Ruffians and special rules that would help. Well, Sid Briarthorn, the ruffian character, he counts as a banner. So that's huge, because whenever you get a character counting as a banner, that's big. In this case, he's still defense 3, I think, so maybe a little easier than normal to kill, but still a huge benefit. They can take war bands of 10 to 12 guys without the need of a hero. Kind of doesn't really apply in battle companies, but certainly helps in the game. They have a special rule called You Do What Sharkey Says, and Sharkey's Standfast affects the entire battlefield. Okay, so that's huge. In SBG, having a Standfast that affects the whole battlefield, that's a really good bonus. They have a special rule called the Chief's Whips. Ruffian models gain +1 to hit when using a whip. Okay, so that's pretty thematic. The impact of that on the game is extremely minimal, because you're talking about, like, I think whips are strength 1, so you're giving the model instead of shoot 5, you go to shoot 4 with a strength 1 weapon. And what's the range, 2 or 3 inches on a whip? So, you know, good idea, but it probably should have just been +1 shoot. What else? They still have more. Special rule, the Chief's Command. Ruffian models within 6 inches of Sharkey may use his courage value instead of their own when making courage tests. So that's another big thing. I think in battle companies there are some equivalent rules to that in the Path of the General. Let me just take a quick look. Yeah, lead by example. Friendly models within 6 inches of the hero gain a bonus of +1 to their courage value. So something similar to that is available if you have a guy following the Path of the General. What else? Special rule, strength in numbers. Whilst this force is not broken, models gain +1 to their courage value. So there's a lot of things going on in that legendary legion to support the courage value of the ruffians. And why would that be? Well, because they're going to lose models like hand over fist because they're all strength or defense 3. So anyway, you can see that in the legendary legion, they really put out a lot of special rules to try to bolster the really poor profile of the ruffian unit. What would I do to try to improve this faction? Because at this point, you're probably only going to see a few changes potentially happen in the FAQ, or designer's notes, that are being updated every 6 months. So what could we see? Well, okay, there's one thing that I definitely think is an oversight here, and that is that this faction should be allowed to go up to 20 models. There's no reason why it shouldn't. Like, if you compare this this faction against Lake Town can go up to 20 models, and it's already better than this faction. Like, the units that are available in Lake Town are better than the units in this faction. And this faction can still only go to 15. Lake Town can go up to 20. So definitely, this faction needs to be allowed to go to 20 models. I'm quite sure this must just be an oversight, and that's something that could be easily fixed in the designer's notes. The other thing in this faction that really I think needs to happen is that you need to be able to advance the ruffian into a better profile. The way it is now, you don't really even want ruffians in your faction, because like the profile for the model is so bad, and it just seems like really kind of silly that you would play this faction and then actively be trying to avoid getting ruffian models in your faction. It doesn't seem right. So give the ruffians another profile that they can advance into. It's only been done, I think, in one other case in the book, and that was for dwarf rangers in the Moria expedition list, where they basically made up a little rule where they can advance into a Moria expeditionary who just gets an additional special rule. So let's do something like that for a ruffian. Like anything, any kind of advancement would be of a benefit. Like maybe you could make him a ruffian veteran who gets 4+ shoot at no extra point cost. And that would make tracking XP more fun and improve the archery of those models, and acknowledge the old profile for the model as well, which used to have a 4+ shoot. In the Legendary Legion and Scouring of Shire, the Chief's Ruffians, one of those is the Chief's Whips, and another is Strength in Numbers. So it'd be a similar thing to those, or like you could even add those 2 special rules to a ruffian veteran, and maybe if you needed to increase the point value by 1, increase it by 1. I honestly don't think you would need to, because even with those 2 rules, really that model is definitely not worth more than 5 points. You could also consider removing the result of nothing on the reinforcement charts. Like every faction, if you roll a 1, it's nothing, but like maybe this one you would consider just like making that still get you something on the reinforcement chart. Or maybe make one of the results you get 2 ruffians, like we see in some of the other factions. One thing you could also do here, and I'm not really sure I would want to do this because it would kind of change the sort of nature of the faction, but you could make an orc one of your starting lineup. So like that way you would have something like a decent profile that you could make one of your starting heroes be an orc, and then they can get a warg as a creature. Certainly that would improve the faction, but I'm not sure it's very thematic. We talked earlier about adding a mercenary fighter to your faction. Like maybe this faction could have a special rule where, like with mercenary fighters, after every battle you have to pay them an additional 2 sort of influence, as it's sort of a tax, like to keep them with your warband. Like maybe in the case of this warband, their special rule would be that they decrease that payment down to 1 influence, because they have like hordes of like stolen like food and booty that they've like robbed off the hobbits. Or even maybe add another wanderer into the game for evil armies. That's like a combat model, like the wandering dwarf that the good side can pick. Maybe add something like that doesn't come with a tax, so there's something that you can just add into this faction to help it out. Anyway guys, thanks for sticking with me on this one here. Let me know what you think. I've thrown out quite a few of my own opinions on this faction and on the models here, so let me know if you think I'm wrong, or if you think I'm right and you agree, or you have other ideas that could help this faction out in battle companies, because quite frankly, as it is now, nobody's going to play this faction. There's just no reason to play it unless you're just a guy that really loves Sharkey's rogues. Like if that's your thing, you may want to play the faction, but in the game you're eventually going to get trounced in every game with this faction, and that's not fun. Even if you're really enjoying the models and the theme of this faction, you're going to end up losing more than 3/4 of your games, and that's not fun. So this faction does need help, so I'd love to hear your ideas. If you have any, put them in the comments. Let me know what you think. Anyway, that's it for now, guys. Thanks for sticking with me on this one, and don't forget to get your toy soldiers out and come and play some battle companies with us at the Ontario Strategy Battle Game League. Thanks guys, we'll see you next time.